Hey guys, welcome back. I have another book review for you today. It is week 3 of our month of true crime. We have 2 books left because lucky us, October has 5 Thursdays, so we get 5 true crime books this month. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, I had a really strange week with reading. I had originally picked out a book to read, bought it, everything, and I decided not to read it. And I'm going to talk to you about that next month. But today, I was really excited about this book. Today, we're going to talk about a book that I was so excited to read, and that is The Stranger Beside Me. It is by Ann Rule, and it was originally published in 1980. So, if you've never heard of The Stranger Beside Me, I can pretty much guarantee that you've heard of the subject of The Stranger Beside Me because it is a story about Ted Bundy. And this one is going to be a little bit different than like things that you would see written today because Ann Rule knew Ted and considered him a very close friend of hers, and she worked with him, and she was just kind of blown away. I'm going to get into that a little bit in a few minutes, but what I am going to tell you is that I ended up rating this book 3 stars, and I was a little bit disappointed with like the book itself. And also, I had a super weird thing last night. So I was about like 85% of the way through the book. I put it down. I went to sleep and I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning. This happened to me when I read the Israel Keys book too. And I was panicking. I was like, can someone break into my house? Like, are my windows locked? And I was very anxious about it. I sat up probably until about 6 o'clock with my lights on, and then I went back to sleep. So I'm pretty tired at this point, but I did finish it today. I read a little bit this morning, and then I finished it up on my lunch break. So yes, so I wanted to just go ahead and do this so I could put it behind me and like have a good night's sleep and everything tonight. Hopefully, like fingers crossed that that happens. So let me tell you about The Stranger Beside Me. It has a lot of parts. So there's a part that opens and it's like the year 2000, and then we go back to like the whole like experience that Anne had with Ted, and then there's a 1986 update, and then there's a 1989 update, and it's just there's a lot of updates because she's like added on over the years. So Anne Rule was a very prolific true crime writer. I would say she wrote a lot about the Pacific Northwest, which is where like Ted Bundy was for a lot of the time. She was a mother of 4, so she was like in her 30s when she met Ted Bundy, who was in his 20s. They worked together at like a crisis center, which is like a suicide hotline type thing. You would call in if you have like an issue and someone can either talk you through it or they can get you help. They can trace the phone calls. You know, it was a helpful thing. And her and Ted worked together on this night shift, and they started talking, and they like kind of became friends. She said he was a nice guy and would walk her out to her car every night. But Anne's main job was like to write for detective magazines, like true detective magazines, and she worked with the police. She went to police seminars. She did ride-alongs. She did a lot of this stuff. She spent a lot of time with police, which you would think would make her like quite attuned to all of this. But in all the time that they knew each other and like rode to Christmas parties together, like doing their thing, being BFFs, like Ted had started this like murder spree in Washington, and it would eventually cover quite a few of the Northwest states. We're talking Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and then move on down to Florida. So Anne knew Ted, and once he was actually arrested, so that wasn't until the 70s, and she just couldn't believe that he would do something like this. He wrote her letters from prison, and they had phone calls and everything else, and this is kind of the story of that. But the part that started to bother me was that she like could not wrap her head around the fact that this like nice guy that used to walk her to her car and was like really charismatic and funny could be doing that. She didn't believe it. She was like, that's not true. Even when he escaped from jail, she was like, well, you know, sometimes like you don't escape because you're guilty. You just escape because you don't want to get caught in the system. The same for why I was running for police, everything. And I was like, you are a mom with 4 children, and she's like middle aged at this point. She's in her, I guess 40 is middle age, maybe 50. I don't know. I don't know exactly what that is. But she's in her 40s and 50s for like a good part of this. And she has 4 children, and like one of her daughters, or maybe she has 3 children. I don't exactly remember. I think it's 4. But like her daughter was like the the victim type, you know, like, and she was just like, no, it could never. And she like felt bad for Ted, and she was like, well, maybe, you know, everyone's just taking everything out on him. And I'm like, I mean, no. Like, so Ted escapes from prison. He goes on to Florida. She hasn't heard about him, but there are murders at the Kymega house and then a house like quite close. And her mom is like, girl, that could be Ted. And she's like, no, it couldn't. He would never do that. So, of course, Ted is arrested in Florida, and come to find out he did do that. She went down to his trial, and, you know, he was, like, his own attorney. It was so much. If you know about the story of Ted Bundy, like, it was wild. There were, like, girls filling the courtrooms that were, like, really attractive and pretty that would sit behind him like a fan club. He was married in prison, had a child in prison, had, like, a slew of women that would help him and send him things, and she was one of them. So I felt like, in all honesty, she had a very high opinion of like herself, because she, as a person that was manipulated by Ted Bundy for 2 decades, 18 years, that it was just like she was so sure until there was one piece of physical evidence, and she saw it and she was like, oh God, he's guilty. There were like 40 coincidences before that, and if you have 1 or 2 coincidences, I could see being like, I'm not sure. 40 is a lot of coincidences. That's a lot of coincidences that she just, you know, it was whatever for her. So she ended up writing the book, The Stranger Beside Me. It was originally, so before the murders really got started, it was just a couple up in Washington. She started writing this book, and he knew that. Ted knew that. Ted knew that she worked with detectives and everything, and she didn't know the book would end up being about him. And he would ask her questions about detectives and act uninterested. To me, it kind of seemed like he was still being her friend because she could help him. I don't know. Clearly, none of us are ever going to know exactly what Ted Bundy was thinking, because how would we? But yes, that is what I think. But then at the end of this 1980 book that she's writing, the end of the first book, she says that Ted Bundy was insane. That, you know, she couldn't believe that he was like found guilty because he was insane. You can't execute anyone who's insane. Florida was a death penalty state at the time. And she was like, he didn't know what he was doing was wrong. He was just like self-gratification, and in his head he thought that that was right. And I'm like, he wasn't insane. He had like an antisocial personality disorder, which does not equal insanity. And he knew that that was wrong, because if he didn't, he wouldn't have tried so hard to hide it. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he didn't care, because all he cared about was like self-gratification. That is my opinion. Just like Anne Rule, I am not a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or anybody that is qualified to like to say anything about that, honestly. But that's my opinion. Everyone is going to have one. So that's my opinion. She later changes her tune a bit and says like he wasn't insane. You know, he knew what he was doing was wrong, which I believe is true as well. I believe that. Ted Bundy was eventually executed in 1989. But the week before his execution, he did finally admit to quite a few murders and tell them where they could find quite a few of the girls who were still missing. So that right before he was executed, he did confess. I think that was, I kind of feel like, and I think a lot of other people do as well, that was in order to hopefully get a stay of execution. But it had already been 11 years. Like, he was not going to get a stay of execution again at that point. I don't think the state of Florida was going to allow that to happen. But that is kind of where we end with, you know, her dealing with the fact that she could not reconcile those people together. She said that girls are constantly like writing to her, even at the time of that. So about like, I think the year 2000, she passed away in 2015. So, but she said people were writing to her saying like, I ran into Ted Bundy, like that was my daughter, just like so many things. And some of those parts of the book were really good, where she was like talking about the aftermath of it all, where like people were contacting her. There were so many stories. They were all trying to find things out. I thought that was like really interesting. I'm not going to say that I didn't learn anything from this book, because I learned a ton. There's so much information packed into this book. So you learn a lot. You learn so much. And I think that's great. I think that it is important to always keep learning. But some of it was a lot. Like, there was one chapter that So I read this on a Kindle. At the bottom, it'll tell you how much time is left in a chapter. There was one chapter that was like 110 minutes of reading time. That is too long. Like, that's too long. You can't focus. But even the ones that were shorter, like 10 minutes or something, I felt like were very long. I feel like I've been reading this book for weeks. And in all actuality, it was probably like 4 days. It wasn't that long, but I feel like I read it for weeks. I will say there is one part of the book that I thought was a little bit graphic and a little bit uncalled for. There is a part where someone has told her, someone that was at the execution, like told her about it, and she wrote it. It's at the very beginning of the book. You'll know that it's coming, so you can skip over that part. I don't think that that part is pertinent to the rest of the book. Like if you skip over that like quite short chapter, I think it was probably like an 8-minute chapter or something, you're not going to miss anything. It bothers me to read about that because Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair, but all of that just really bothers. I don't like to read that. Like that's just me though. I don't like to watch it played out in front of me on TV or anything like that either. So that's me personally. That is the most graphic part of the book. They do talk about the different like victims and the crime scenes and things like that, but that's no worse than what you would see on like an episode of Law and Order. I think the most graphic part comes very early on, and that is the execution part. The rest of it is no worse than like what you would read, like what you would see on Law and Order. Like it's very like I'm sure the crime scenes were terrible, but she doesn't talk about them as like deeply as she did about that. Again, that's my opinion. And that might not bother you. If that doesn't bother you, then that's no problem. It did just like just a little bit for me, but it might not be like that for you. Otherwise, I thought this book was fine. If this is something that you're interested in, I definitely suggest reading it because it's kind of a different perspective. There is another book that Ted's longtime girlfriend wrote that is also on my TBR list that I really want to read. It's called The Phantom Prince. Once I get my hands on that and read it, maybe I can do a video for you guys where we talk about like the differences in those. I'm not going to read like 20 Ted Bundy biographies. I honestly don't believe that I can. Like I said, I was like freaking out last night, but I will not right now, but maybe like next year or something, read that other one and then we can talk about like how similar and how different they are and things like that because I think that might be really interesting. But that is all I have for you guys this week. I hope that you enjoyed it and I'll see you next week. Bye.